Chapter 16. Dear Mr. Johns, Dixon wrote, gripping his pencil like a bread knife. This is just to let you know that I know what you are up to with young Marlene Richards. Young Marlene is a decent girl and has got no time for your sort. I know your sort. She is a decent girl, and I won't have you filing her head with a lot of art and music. She is too good for that, and I'm going to marry her, which is more than your sort ever do. So just you keep of her, Mr. Johns. This will be your only warning. This is just a friendly letter, and I'm not threatening you, but you just do as I say, else me and some of my pals from the works will be up your way, and we shan't be coming along just to say how you can bet. So just you watch out and lay of young Marlene if you know what's good for you. Yours faithfully, Joe Higgins. He read it through, thinking how admirably consistent were the style and orthography, both derived in large part from the essays of some of his less proficient pupils. He could hardly hope, even so, to deceive Johns for long, especially since Johns had almost certainly got no further with Marlene Richards, a typist in his office, than staring palely at her across it. But the letter would at any rate give him a turn and his digmates a few moments' amusement, which it was when it was open, according to his habit, at the breakfast table and read over cornflakes. Dixon wrote to Mr. Johns and the address of the digs on a cheap envelope, not specifically bought for the purpose, sealed the letter up in it, and then grimming his finger on the sealed, no, grimming his finger on the floor, drew a heavy smudge across the flap, so he's just closing the envelope. Finally, he stuck a stamp on, slobbering on it for further ver- verisimilitude. 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 One word. Verisimilitude? Similitude? But with VERI. Verisimilitude. He posted a letter on his way down to the pub for a lunchtime drink, but before that he must write up some of his notes for the Merry England lecture. Before that, in turn, he must review his financial position, see if he could somehow restore it from complete impossibility to its usual level of merely imminent disaster. And before that, again, he must meditate, just for a couple of minutes, on the incredible finale to the summer ball the previous evening, and on Christine. He found himself unable to think coherently about, hardly able even to remember what they'd said to each other at the Welches, nor could he now evoke what it had been like kissing her more clearly that he'd enjoyed it. He was already so excited about Tuesday afternoon that he had to get up and walk around about his bedroom. The great thing was to convince himself utterly that she wouldn't turn up. Then whatever happened would be something extra. The trouble was that he could imagine exactly how she'd look coming across the hotel lounge towards him. Then he found he could visualize her face quite clearly and look inattentively out over the back garden of the lodging house, which lay in thick, beating sunshine. He realized that when it wasn't set in that rather chilly life mask, her face sometimes touched upon other sorts of face by a kind of physiognomical illusions. Some of the other sorts of face were very remote from her own. There was the permanent sun dazzle of some honorable trollop photographed motorboating on the Riviera, the sulky mindless glare theoretically detectable on the face of a pinup, the frown of a plethoric faces. No, the frown of a plethoric and not very nice little girl. At any rate, they were all female faces. He coughed loudly on recalling that Margaret had more than once reminded him facially of a man with an unintelligible accent, service glasses, whom he known by sight in the RAF, and had never seen doing anything except sweeping out the NAAFI and wiping his nose on his sleeve. To drive this thought away, he opened the cupboard that contained his smoking engines and accessories, monuments, some of them costly to economy. As long as he could remember, he'd never been able to smoke as much as he wanted to. This armory of devices had been assembled as each fresh way of seeming to smoke as much as he wanted to had come to his notice. The desiccated packet of cheap cigarette tobacco, the cherrywood pipe, the red packet of cigarette papers, the packet of pipe cleaners, the leather cigarette machine, the quadripartite pipe tool, the crumbling packet of cheap pipe tobacco, the packet of cotton wool filter tips, new process, the nickel cigarette machine, the clay pipe, the briar pipe, the blue packet of cigarette papers, the packet of herbal smoking mixture, guaranteed free from nicotine or other harmful substances. Why? The rusting tin of expensive pipe tobacco, the packet of chalk pipe filters. Dixon took a cigarette from the packet in his pocket and lit it. On the floor of the cupboard were the empty beer flagons, which represented his only sure method of saving money. There were 9 of these, but 2 of them belonged to an impossibly distant pub. He'd bought them to drink in the bus on the way back from the Toynbee Society dinner in February. He hoped by their aid to efface the memory of a traumatically embarrassing speech Margaret had made at the dinner. But sitting next to him throughout the journey back, she vetoed his project on disciplinary grounds. There'd been a lot of students in the bus, most of them drinking beer from flagons. He shivered at this memory, tried to drive it away by totting up the exchange value of the other 7 bottles, 2 and 8 altogether, much less than he counted on. He decided not to review his financial position and was just getting out his Merry England notes when there was a knock at this door, and Margaret came in. She was wearing the green paisley frock and the quasi-velvet shoes. "Hello, Margaret," he said with a heartiness which originated, he realized, in a guilty conscience. But why had he got a guilty conscience? Leaving her with Goyer Cart at the ball had been tactful, hadn't it? She looked at him with her air of not being quite sure who he was, which had more than once entirely and unaided discomposed him. "Oh, hello," she said. "How are you?" he asked, keeping up the grimmick friendliness. "Have a seat." He pushed forward the immense crippled armchair, Pall Mall smoking room size and design, that took up almost half of the space he left unoccupied by the bed. "Cigarette?" He took out his packet to show that this was a sincere offer. Still looking at him, she shook her head slowly, like a doctor, indicating that there was no hope. Her face had a yellowish tinge and her nostrils seemed pinched. She remained standing and not saying anything. "Well, how are things?" Dixon said, tugging a smile on his mouth. She shook her head again, a little more slowly, and sat down on the arm of the chair, which creaked sharply. Dixon threw his pajamas onto his bed and sat down on a cane-bottomed chair with his back to the window. "Do you hate me, James?" she said. Dixon wanted to rush at her and tip her backwards in the chair, to make a deafening rude noise in her face, to push a bead up her nose. "How do you mean?" he asked. It took her a quarter of an hour to make clear how she meant. She talked fast and fluently, moving about a lot on the chair, her legs kicking straight as if hammered on the knee, her head jerking to restore invisible strands of hair, her thumbs bending and straightening. Why had he deserted her at the ball like that? Or rather, since she and he and everyone else knew, why? What did he think he was up to? Or rather again, how could he do this to her? In exchange for such information on these and allied problems as he could give, she offered the news that all 3 Welches were out for his bloods, and that Christine had referred slightingly to him at breakfast that morning. No mention of Goyer Curehart was made beyond a parenthetical attack on Dixon's rudeness and leaving the dance without saying goodnight to him. Dixon knew from experience that to counterattack Margaret was invariably mistaken, but he was too angry to bother about that. When he was sure that he was going to say more about Goyer Curehart, he said, his heart pounding a little, "I don't see why you're kicking up all this fuss. You looked as if you were doing all right for yourself when I left." "What the hell do you mean by that? You were all over that Gore Itchbag character. Hadn't got time to say a single word to me, had you? If you didn't do yourself any good, it wasn't for want of trying. I've never seen such an exhibition in my life." His voice tailed off. Couldn't synthesize enough of the required righteous indignation. She stared at him wide-eyed. "But you can't mean—" "Oh yes, I bloody well can. Of course I can mean. James, you don't know what you're talking about," she said slowly and painfully, like a foreigner reading out of a phrase book. "Really, I'm so surprised. I just don't know what to say." She began to tremble. "I talked to a man just for a few minutes, that's all it was, and now you start accusing me of making up to him. That's what you mean? Isn't that what you mean?" Her voice quavered grotesquely. "That's what I mean, all right," Dixon said, trying to squeeze anger in his tone. "It's no use denying it." He could only manage to sound a little nettled and out of sorts. "Do you really think I was trying to make up to him?" "Well, it looked very much like it, you must admit." Going so close to Dixon that he flinched, she began looking out of the window. He couldn't see her face without craning his neck, so he took her seat on the arm of the Pall Mall armchair. She stayed there so long without moving that he began to hope she'd forgotten all about him. In a few minutes he might be able to slip silently out of the pub. Then she began to speak, sounding quite calm. "I'm afraid there's an awful lot you don't understand, James. I used to think you understood me, but now, you see, when you say a thing like that, I don't mind it being offensive and all that, because I know you feel bad about this. At least I hope you do, for my own sake, and so I don't mind you. Try to lash out at me. What makes me feel so unhappy is the awful gulf it shows that there is between us. It makes me say to myself, oh, it's no good. He just doesn't know me at all. Never has done. Either you see that, don't you?" Dixon didn't make a face. He was afraid she might see it reflected in the window pane. "Yes," he said. "I don't want to go into it all, James. It's such a small, petty, trivial thing, but I suppose I better a little." She sighed. "Can you distinguish between—" "No, obviously you can't. I'll just tell you this, just this one thing, and see whether that'll satisfy you." She turned and faced him, then said less calmly than before, "After you gone last night, I didn't spend a single moment with Goyer Curehart. He was with Carol Goldsmith. I spent the whole of the rest of the time with Bertrand. Thank you very much. Her voice went up, and you can guess what sort of a... Well, hard luck. Dixon broke in before he should have time to relent. A grandiose disgust for the whole proceedings had filled him, not merely for this one head, but for the whole game of poker, of non-stop strip poker that he and Margaret were playing. Biting his lips, he vowed to himself that this time he'd take whatever she might have to deal out. He remembered Carol's phrase about not throwing Margaret any life belts. Well, he'd thrown his last one. He would not waste any more time trying to conciliate her. More because he knew it was a waste of time than because his powers of conciliation were at an end, though they were pretty well at an end as well. Look here, Margaret, he said. I've no desire to hurt your feelings unnecessarily, as you know perfectly well, whatever you may say, but for your own sake as well as mine, you must get some things straight. I know you had a very hard time recently, and I know that as well, but it won't do you any good to go on thinking what you evidently do think about me and how we stand. It'll only make things worse. What I want to say is you must stop depending on me emotionally like this. I agree, I was probably in the wrong over the dance business, but right or wrong won't make any difference to this. I'll stick up for you and I'll chat to you and I'll sympathize, but I've had enough of being forced into a false position. Get it into your head that I've quite lost whatever interest I may have had in you as a woman, as someone to make love to or go to bed with. No, you can have your turn in a minute. This time you're going to hear me out. Okay, I think she said that. What? I've lost quite whatever interest I may have had in you as a woman, as someone to make love to or go to bed with. No, you can have your turn in a minute. This is all finished. Okay, he's pretty much, he answered as he's speaking. He's assuming she was gonna say, "Oh, you only care about me in bed," or no, you can't have your turn. You can have your turn in a minute. This time you're going to hear me out. As I said, the sex business is all finished. If it ever got started, I'm not blaming anyone. I just want to tell you, you must count me out as far as anything like that's concerned. That's how things are, and I can't say I'm sorry because you can't say you're sorry for what you can't do anything about, and I can't do anything about this, and neither can you. That's all. You don't think she'd have you, do you? A shabby little provincial bore like you? Margaret burst out as soon as she stopped speaking. Or has she had you already? Perhaps she just wanted a... Don't be fantastic, Margaret. Come off the stage for a moment, do you? There was a pause, and she came waveringly forward, put her hands on his shoulders, and seemed to collapse or be dragging him onto the bed. Unregarded, her spectacles fell off. She was making a curious noise, a steady, repeated, low-pitched moan that sounded as if it came from the pit of her stomach, as if she'd been sick over and over again and still wanted to be sick. Dixon half helped, half lifted her onto the bed. Now and then she gave a quiet, almost skittish little scream. Her face was pushed hard against his chest. Dixon didn't know whether she was fainting or having a fit of hysterics, or simply breaking down and crying. Whatever it was, he didn't know how to deal with it. When she felt that she was sitting on the bed next to him, she threw herself forward so that her face was on his thigh. In a moment, he felt moisture creeping through his skin. He tried to lift her, but she was immovably heavy. Her shoulders were shaking more rapidly than she seemed to him normal even in a condition of this kind. More rapidly than seemed to him normal even in a condition of this kind. Then she raised herself, tense but still trembling, and began a series of high-pitched inward screams which alternated with deep moans. Both were quite loud. Her hair was in her eyes, her lips were drawn back, and her teeth chattered. Her face was wet with saliva as well as tears. At last, as he began speaking her name, she threw herself violently backwards and sideways onto the bed, while she lay there with her arms spread out. Writhing, she screamed half a dozen times, very loudly, then went on more quietly, moaning with every outward breath. Dixon seized her wrist and shouted, "Margaret, Margaret!" She looked at him with dilated eyes and began struggling, trying to free herself from him. Two lots of footsteps were now approaching outside, one ascending the stairs, the other descending. The door opened and Bill Atkinson came in, followed by Miss Cutler. Dixon looked up at them. "Hysterics, eh?" Atkinson said, and slapped Margaret several times on the face, very hard, Dixon thought. He pushed Dixon out of the way and sat down on the bed, gripping Margaret by the shoulders and shaking her vigorously. "There's some whiskey up in the cupboard. Go and get it." Dixon ran out and up the stairs. The only thought that presented itself to him at all clearly was one of the mild surprise that fictional or cinematic treatment of hysterics should be based so firmly on what was evidently the right treatment. He found the whiskey. His hand was shaking so much that he nearly dropped the bottle. He uncorked and took a quick swig, trying not to cough. Down in his room again, he found everything much quieter. Miss Cutler, who'd been watching Atkinson, and Margaret gave Dixon a glance, not of suspicion or reproach, but of reassurance. She said nothing. As he felt at the moment, this made him want to cry. Atkinson looked up without taking the bottle. "Get a glass or a cup." He got a glass from the cupboard, poured some of the whiskey into it, and gave it to Atkinson. Miss Cutler, as much in awe of him as ever, stood at Dixon's side and watched Margaret being given some whiskey. Atkinson heaved her up into a half-sitting position. Her moans had stopped, and she was trembling less violently. Her face was red from Atkinson's blows. When he put the cup to her mouth, it rattled once or twice on her teeth, and her breathing was audible. With eerie predictability, she choked and coughed, swallowed some, coughed again, swallowed some more. Quite soon, she stopped trembling altogether and began to look around at them. "Sorry about that," she said faintly. "That's all right, girlie," Atkinson said. "Like a fag?" "Yes, please. Forward, Jim." Miss Cutler smiled at them all, mouthed something, and went quietly out. Dixon lit cigarettes for the three of them, and Margaret sat up on the edge of the bed. Atkinson still kept his arm around her. "Were you the one that slapped my face?" she asked him. "That's right, girlie. It did you a power of good. How do you feel now?" "A lot better, thanks. A bit hazy, but otherwise all right." "Good. Don't you try to move around for a bit. Here, put your feet up and have a rest." "There's really no need." He pulled her feet up onto the bed and took off her shoes and stood looking down at her. "You stay there for 10 minutes at least. I'll leave you to the care of Brother Jim now. Have some more whiskey when you finish that, but don't let Jim get at it. I promised his mother not to let him drink himself to death." He turned his tartar's face on Dixon. "All right, old man." "Yes, thanks, Bill. It's been very good of you." "All right, girlie. Thank you so much, Mr. Atkinson. You've been wonderful. I just can't thank you enough." "That's all right, girlie." He nodded to them and went out. "I'm sorry about all that, James," she said as soon as the door was shut. "It was my fault." "No, you always say that. This time I'm going to let you. I just couldn't take what you said." "I'm not going to let you. I couldn't take what you said, that's all. I thought to myself, I can't bear it. I must stop him, and then I simply lost control of myself. Nothing more to it than that. And it was also silly and childish because you were absolutely right saying what you did. Much better to clear the air like that. I just behaved like a perfect idiot. There's no point in reproaching yourself. You couldn't help it." "No, but I ought to have been able to sit down. I thought I should have been able to, you know. And do sit down, James. You're getting on my nerves, prowling around like that." Dixon pulled the cane-bottomed chair to the bedside, beside the bed. When he was settled and looking at Margaret, he was reminded of how he had sat at her side just like this when he visited her in the hospital after a suicide attempt. But she looked different then, thinner and weaker, with her hair drawn back to the nape of her neck, and in a way less distressing than she looked now. The sight of her smudged lipstick, the damp nose, her disordered, stiff hair filled him with a profound and tranquil depression. "I better come to the Welches with you," he said. "My dear, I wouldn't hear of it. You better keep clear of that place as long as you can." "I don't care about any of that. In any case, I need to come in. I'll just come back on the bus with you." "Don't be so ridiculous, James. It's absolutely unnecessary. I'm perfectly all right now. At least I will be when I had another go at nice Mr. Atkinson's whiskey. Would you be an angel and pour me some?" While he complied, Dixon thought with relief that he needn't go back on the bus with her. By now he could always tell what Margaret wanted, whatever she might say, and what it was clear that this refusal of services was genuine. It wasn't that he didn't feel concern for her. He felt a lot, so much that the load was intolerable. Intolerable, too, was a way in which to feel concern had now come for him to confuse itself utterly with the feeling of guilt. He gave her the cup, not looking at her. He said nothing, not for the familiar reason of not being able to say what he wanted to say, but because he could think of nothing to say. "Oh, my arms are sore. I feel like my neck's getting cramped or something." What was it? I'll just drink this and finish my cigarette, and then I'll be off. There's a bus at 22. It'll get me in nicely. Would you get me an ashtray, James? He brought her a copper one which bore the representation in high relief of a small antique warship and the caption "HM Torpedo Boat Destroyer Ribble." She dropped ash onto it, then sat up on the edge of the bed, taking cosmetics from her handbag, began making up her face. Looking up into her compact mirror, she said conversationally, "It's strange that it should end like this, isn't it? In such a very undignified fashion." When he still said nothing, she went on, moving her mouth about now and then, put lipstick on it. "But then it hasn't been very dignified all the way through, has it? It's just been me flying off the handle in one way or another, and you rather reluctantly trying to get me to grow up. No, that's not fair to you." She worked lipstick over her mouth and peered into the mirror again. "You did all a man could do, and more than most would, believe me. You got nothing to reproach yourself with, really. I don't know how you stuck it. I'm afraid none of it's been much fun for you. Just as well as you decided to call it quits." She snapped the compact shut and put it into her handbag. "Oh, I gotta stretch. I gotta get up or something. Go for a walk." "You know I'm fond of you," Margaret, Dixon said. "It's just that it wouldn't work out, that's all." "I know, James. Don't worry about anything. I shall be all right. You must always come to me if anything goes wrong that I can do anything about." What'd you say? You must always come to me if anything goes wrong. That I can't do anything about. She smiled slightly at his reservation. Of course I will, she said, as if she were soothing him. I want to be able to read this more better for you guys, but my neck is hurting. Oh, it feels like if it was like once, like right before it cramped, but it's not cramping. It's just like pain, like on my bones and my spine and in my shoulders. He raised his head and looked at her under the powder. Her cheeks were still slightly mottled where the redness was fading, but with their glasses back on, the slight puffiness round her eyes was scarcely noticeable. And she'd only recently finished being hysterical seemed incredible to him, as did she thought that he could ever have said to her anything important enough to make her hysterical. As he watched her, she put out her cigarette on HMS Ribble and stood up, brushing the ash from her dress. That just about takes care of everything, I think, she said lightly. Well, goodbye, James, Dixon said uncertainly. What a pity it was, he thought, that she wasn't better looking, that she didn't read the articles in the 3-halfpenny press that told you which color lipstick went with which natural coloring. With 20% more of what she lacked in these ways, she never had run into any of her appalling difficulties, of vices and morbidities. Bread of loneliness would have remained safely dormant until old age. Are you sure you're all right? He asked her. Stop worrying about me. I'm perfectly all right. Now I must be off, or I shall miss my bus, and that'll make me late for lunch. And you know what Mrs. Nettie is about mealtimes. Well, I dare say we shall run into each other before very long. Goodbye. Goodbye, Margaret. See you soon. She went on without replying. Dixon put his cigarette out, jabbing at Ribble's bridge in a feeble rage he couldn't find any source for. He tried to tell himself that when he got over his own feelings of shock, he'd begin to be glad, having told Margaret what he had been wanting to tell her for so long. But it wasn't convincing. He thought of his appointment with Christine the next day, but one, and regarded it entirely without pleasure. Some part of what had happened in the last half hour had spoiled all that, though he didn't know which part. Somewhere his path to Christine was blocked. It was all going wrong in some way he couldn't foresee. It wasn't that Margaret herself would take a hand in the matter and upset things by somehow alerting Bertrand and the senior Welchers. It wasn't that he might be forced to withdraw his recent declarations to Margaret. It was something less unlikely than the first, harder to fight than the second, and much vaguer than either. It was just that everything seemed to be spoilt. He began abstractly brushing his hair in front of his small, unframed mirror. He refused to think directly about Margaret's fit of hysterics. Soon enough, he knew it would take its place with those 3 or 4 memories which could make him actually twist about in his chair or bed, or remorse, fear, or embarrassment. It would probably supplant the present top of the list item, the time he'd been pushed out in front of the curtain after a school concert to make the audience sing the national anthem. He could hear his own voice now saying in those flat tones, heavy with insincerity, "And now I want you all to join with me, if you will, in singing." And then he led off in a key that must have been exactly half an octave, above or below the proper one, switching every few notes like everybody else from one octave to the other, half a beat in front of her or behind everybody else. He'd gone through the whole thing. Cheers, applause, and laughter had followed him when he ducked his burning face back through the curtains. He looked at his face now in the mirror and looked back to him, humorless and self-pitying. He picked up Atkinson's whiskey bottle and went to the door, intending to suggest a couple of pints of beer at the pub round the corner. Then he turned back and picked up the letter to John's. There seemed no point in not posting it. I guess he's just writing a funny letter. I don't know who he's writing to. Somebody's cheating. Somebody. Yeah, so it's funny, a little scene. She gets all hysterical. I don't know. James is kind of a mean guy, man. But shout out to Margaret, man. Shout out to Margaret. Shout out to Margaret. And Christine. See how this goes. Okay, I'm gonna reach chapter 17 right now. Peace, y'all.